Welcome, my kings and queens of the jungle, to the Daily DLP. I'm still your host, Ash Thompson, and today I'm going to discuss another quick statistical measurement that immediately tells you whether or not the passing game is healthy and productive in the NFL, with a pretty high level of accuracy. Now, on yesterday's show, I went over the Lions' success rate stats. And for those who missed it, success rate determines whether a given play was successful relative to the down and distance in which it occurred. It takes into account that an 11-yard play on 3rd and 15 isn't a success, while a 2-yard run on 3rd and 1 is a better play than a 3-yard run on 1st and 10. Now, I don't really play fantasy football all that seriously anymore. But I'm going to give you the metrics I used to use to judge fantasy quarterbacks when I was playing in a lot of cash leagues and way too much daily fantasy. Volume stats are what score, but for all but the top tier performers, they're extremely inconsistent. With more QBs running the ball more often, a little bit of this stuff can be forgiven, but we know who the exceptions are. Guys like Justin Fields and Anthony Richardson can at times make up for their poor performance in some of these metrics with their running ability. But eventually, for a QB to be a sustainable quarterback in the league, they need to get these first couple stats in balance and deal with the second couple stats I'm going to talk about. This basically gives you the picture of whether or not a team's passing game is working and healthy with a quarterback at the helm. The first stat is yards per attempt. It's a pretty simple stat to understand. It's yards gained divided by pass attempts. Kind of the most basic type of stats. Obviously, the higher number is better. For this stat, a player with a number less than 7 has rarely had a good year, but hitting 7 doesn't necessarily in and of itself teach you much. In 2022, Marcus Mariota, Russell Wilson, Taylor Heineke, Jacoby Brissett, Justin Fields, and Zach Wilson all hit that 7 threshold. Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady were among the quarterbacks who did not. And I don't think there's too many people who would take anyone off that first list over either of those two guys on that second list. But just as the stat is a pretty basic way to tell whether or not something's working. But in the same way that David Montgomery's yards per carry stat on Thursday, which I discussed yesterday, didn't really tell the entire story because it lacked context. Using an example from Sunday's games, Russell Wilson completed 79.4% of his passes and had 2 touchdowns. Great day, right? Well, he only had 177 yards in the air for an average of 5.2 yards per attempt, so a pass was barely more effective than running the ball, which that is not how that's supposed to work. Does that kind of change your opinion a little bit on whether Wilson had a good day or not? Like, yes, the 2 touchdowns are nice. That percentage is nice, but it was clearly just short passes, checkdowns. Not really a whole lot going on. But they're also having receiver health issues. Nobody knew what Sean Payton was going to do with the Broncos offense this week. But if they can't find a way to raise that number above that 7 threshold, it's going to be a problem for them long term over the course of an entire season. Teams will plug up the first 15 yards of the line of scrimmage, and it'll force Wilson to basically be perfect. This is kind of what the Lions ran into in 2021 with Jared Goff. Like, there were just no weapons on the field, nobody to throw to, nobody could stretch anything. And, there was a game where they passed the ball 11 times because the passing game was not really working in 2021 particularly well. Goff's yards per attempt in week 1 crossed that line with a respectable 7.2. His season total last year, by the way, was 7.6. And I'm going to go over both of those. What did he do week 1? What did he do last year for all of these stats? And just kind of take a look at what the health was. The second stat I compare that stat to is from Pro Football Reference, and it's adjusted yards per attempt. Now, the relationship between those two numbers is where you generally can tell pretty much whether a player had a good season or not. The math behind the adjustment in those adjusted yards, Because again, Pro Football Reference is really good for telling you what their stats actually mean and how they're calculated. It's the yards, and then you multiply the number of touchdown passes by 20 and add that to the yards. Then you subtract 45 times the number of interceptions. So if he has 3 TDs, you add 60. If he has 3 interceptions, you subtract 135. Then you do your division by the number of throws. Square? All right. As a raw number, this doesn't really mean anything. It has, value in a specific context, and that is that the adjusted yards per attempt needs to be higher than the raw yards per attempt if the player had a good year. If it's not, he didn't. For example, Dak Prescott had a yards per attempt of 7.3, which is a good number. But his adjusted air yards per attempt was 6.7. His 15 interceptions kind of make that yards per play number irrelevant. Where someone like Tom Brady was still a pretty good quarterback in 2022. It was far from his peak. He didn't have the same pop in his arm that we'd seen for 2 decades. And his yards per attempt reflected that. It was only 6.4. But his adjusted yards went up because while he wasn't as explosive as he'd been in the past, he was still relatively careful with the ball. Jared Goff's adjusted yards per attempt were 0.6 higher than his unadjusted number. He came home with a 7.8 on Thursday. The third stat that I use is TD percentage. And this corrects for volume, pure and simple. Brock Purdy only started 5 games last year, so he's not going to show up among the league's touchdown leaders with his 13 touchdowns, or the yardage leaders with his 1,374 yards. And you can go on a per-game basis, but that, again, doesn't really tell you how efficiently the player used the opportunities that were given to him. It's still a bit of a volume-based stat. But Purdy's TD percentage of 7.6% of his throws were touchdowns last year was beyond elite. That's getting into Tom Brady 50 touchdown kind of seasons. Patrick Mahomes last year was almost a full point below that, just as an example. He had a 6.8. And that's the thing with small sample sizes, they can give you some unsustainable numbers. Like, none of this really works for the current season until about week 6 or so, particularly accurately. Like, I can tell you whether a guy had a good game or not, but in terms of the season long, if you were using this to base a thing that you were putting money down on, it's not really accurate until you have more data. Brock Purdy being better than Patrick Mahomes for any lengthy period at anything would obviously be a bit of a shocker, but he had a very good run to the playoffs last year. He threw a lot of touchdowns relative to the number of attempts that he had. It's pretty rare for a QB having a legitimately good year to have a TD percentage lower than about 4.5. Going back to Brady last year, he was down to 3.4, which was the lowest of his career, and just over half of his 6% the previous season. In his 50 TD season, he was up at 8.7. Madness. Sometimes a team will kind of squint themselves into believing a player that hasn't consistently hit this threshold is worth big money. Daniel Jones, as an example. It usually doesn't end well, let's say. And the reason relates to the final stat, but before I get to that, last year Goff had a very respectable 4.9%. And on Thursday night, with only 1 TD pass, Goff only had a 2.9%. It's one game. We can't draw any conclusions other than that the passing game did not put up points like we would hope that it did. If that fumble is a touchdown, that completely flips that number. It's a game of inches. It's a game of single plays. Unfortunately, that did not work out. Anyway, the fourth stat I look at when judging quarterbacks is the interception percentage. 2% is the almost magic number where this percentage can be for a player to be said to have had a good season. Nobody likes turnovers, and if your team doesn't throw the ball a lot, they're even more damaging to the prospect of winning. But the real key here is the ratio of TD percentage to interception percentage. That 4.5 to 2 ratio is kind of the bare minimum. If the TDs go up significantly, you can throw a few more interceptions. You can get away with a bit more in terms of turnovers if your TD production is higher. And Josh Allen is the best example of this. Like last year, Allen threw 14 interceptions, and nobody talks about that. It's too many. Like that is not a good or sustainable number for a quarterback who is regarded on that elite level, as Josh Allen definitely is by anyone who pays attention to football. But the other side of the coin was that he threw 35 touchdowns on that same number of passes. So Josh Allen is basically the embodiment of the old Bruce Arians philosophy of no risk it, no biscuit. But because his TD percentage is 6.3, tied for second in the league, he can get away with that 2.5% interception percentage, and nobody's even going to blink at it. It's the cost of doing business with that particular player. Kind of like it was with Stafford in his good years for Detroit and in the Super Bowl year with the Rams. But you'd still rather that it be the 2.0 of Tua or the 1.9 of Mahomes, who is another high event guy. He just keeps the turnover production a little bit lower. Certainly nobody in Buffalo is calling for Allen's head, unlike Dak Prescott, who only had one more interception on the season than Allen did. But he's had NFL fan bases mocking him all offseason for that 15 interception number. Of course, Prescott only played 12 games. So his horrific interception percentage is 3.8 on last year, nearly double the acceptable 2.0 number. So while he had a solid TD percentage of 5.8, that's actually a very good number. All of those picks paint a picture of something that is a player not particularly helping the team. Just to put this number into perspective, the list of players who are not on rookie contracts and had an interception percentage over 2 and still play for the team that they were on last year, it's not a long list. Dak at his 3.8, Matthew Stafford at his 2.6, Russell Wilson at his 2.3, surprisingly Kirk Cousins, game manager guy, was at 2.2, and Lamar Jackson was at 2.1. Now, there's only one of those 5 guys who kept their job after having this interception percentage that wouldn't cost the team $48 million or more in dead cap to get rid of this year. And there were rumors swirling around Dak Prescott. They did trade for Trey Lance. Matthew Stafford was said to have been discussed at various points by the Rams in trade talks. There's been rumors that they wanted to move on from Cousins for years. This is the first year I think there's any actual basis toward that possibility. But I mean, they were coming off a huge thing, and he's got a huge contract. And if you're looking for a reason that the Ravens might have been a little bit hesitant to hand out a huge contract to Lamar Jackson, his career 2.3 interception percentage is likely part of the reason why they were having some cold feet. Jared Goff didn't throw an interception on Thursday, so his ratio is an infinite vertical line, as it has been for the 3rd longest streak now in NFL history. So, as we go forward, I'm going to talk about these stats probably a lot. In game previews, in game recaps, in the Slack channel, which is a really fun place to be if you can kind of remain chill. So how was Jared Goff's Week 1 performance in my estimation by my statistical landmarks? Well, he hit 3 of my 4 benchmarks, but it's not really a great one-game measurement, as I said. That's not really what it's for. He hit the 7.2 yards per attempt, good number. 1 touchdown was less than you'd like, but no interceptions was huge in the outcome of a tight game against the Super Bowl champions. The good TD to INT ratio means that his adjusted yards per attempt were higher than his yards per attempt, which again, probably the most important thing that I've spoken about today. He had a very good, not a great game for the Lions in Week 1 versus the Chiefs. This should all probably get a little bit easier for reasons we'll go into later, around Week 7 or so. Have a great time.
Bring it in here together. Let's go. Come on, baby. Lions on 3. 1, 2, 3.
You've had enough of that shit.